My name is Tyler Smith, and I'm a sophomore here at HLS studying diplomacy, security, and governance, as well as Mandarin Chinese. I also have the honor of being president of the United Nations Association's chapter here at Indiana University, as well as I'm a member of the Global Student 7 Dean's Advisory Council for Dean Lee Feinstein. So through that work, I've learned that a large amount of HLS students have a distinct interest in national security. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Fred Cate, who will be moderating today's panel. Dr. Cate honed his expertise in national security as the founding director of IU's Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research, as well as the vice president for research here at Indiana University. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists and Dr. Fred Cate.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. I would say I learned about cyber threats from cybersecurity, and I learned about all sorts of global threats as Vice President for Research, dealing with them on a daily basis. We have a terrific panel today. You have their complete bios, so I'm going to take just a moment and introduce them very briefly, and then we're going to dive right into the subject, because we have a large panel and a big subject and 14 minutes left to deal with it. So starting at the far left, although that's maybe an unusual thing to say, Todd Lindberg, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, focusing on national security and a variety of other foreign policy issues, and a member here of the faculty in the Hamilton Luker School. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you. And next, moving over to the right, again, this is not to my right, that's not going to actually be true either. Derek Chollet, Executive Vice President, Senior Advisor for Security and Defense Policy at the German Marshall Fund. And then in the center, Juliette Kayyem, who is the Belfer Lecturer in International Security at Harvard Law School, as well as so many other things, including CEO of Zimcar, which I guess is not directly relevant to this, but extremely interesting. Maybe you'll work in getting to talk about that, and the founder of Kayyem Solutions. And then moving one more to the right is Lucas Kello, the senior lecturer in international relations and director of the Center for Technology and Global Affairs at Oxford University. And then finally on my immediate list is Christopher Kojm, the Elliott School of a professor at the Elliott School for International Affairs at the George Washington University and the former chair of the National Intelligence Council. So our topic today is a very broad one. So this initially, when maybe half of us were invited to the panel, we were invited to talk about cyber and technology threats. And then they thought that was just too narrow. How would we fill an hour and 15 minutes if we just talked about that? So Lee, being nothing if not ambitious, added to that all global threats. So I don't know what we'll do with our extra time when we finally get there. So I think what is striking, and obviously in this audience many of you are well aware, that when we saw the worldwide threat assessment given to Congress in January of this year, although media coverage tended to focus a lot on the question of whether the intelligence chiefs were differing from the president on this assessment, the assessment itself is actually quite striking because of its enormous breadth. Issues that we might have thought were, or might have at least hoped had achieved some resolution, such as nuclear proliferation issues, were clearly brought back. Issues of regional conflicts and the way that they will draw in the United States and other players. Questions of new alignments was raised, and even issues with which we've become sort of painfully familiar, like cybersecurity, suddenly were presented in a new and even broader light, that it would not just be cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, but efforts to infiltrate elections, sway public opinion, and otherwise destabilize Western powers. And so I want to start with a really open-ended question. And I encourage you to be brief and sharp in answering it, because you're going to get another chance at it. But as you look out at this massive horizon of threats, what would you say is the greatest threat today facing the United States? And Todd, why don't we start with you, if you don't mind? Yeah. You can pick anything, because you're first. So.
I think that we are in the realm of black swan kind of events, I think, just in thinking about this. There's some conventional threats that we had plenty of time to think about, whether that's something going bad between China and Taiwan, or the Russians getting more difficult, et cetera. But I'm glad that actually the panel got expanded out to this, but not because that diminishes the importance of cyber, but rather because it emphasizes it. Because I think now cyber is an important element in all of these threats. It is a dimension that is unknown in terms of its relationship to physical conflict, and one that we are unfortunately probably going to find out about. I don't know if it's going to be by 2020, and I hope it isn't. But frankly, if you had to bet, that's where you put the money, I think.
Okay, cyber.
Well, look, I largely agree with Todd. When I think of threats and you look at the national security strategy, you look at the national defense strategy, you look at the intelligence assessment that was released earlier this year, you do see a pretty typical breakdown of threats from China and Russia being front and center to disrupting states like Iran and North Korea, to failing states like Venezuela and Libya, to super empowered individuals like the New Zealand terrorists and ISIS and other terrorist groups. And the through line is the digital space. And a friend of ours, many of us here, Bob Kayyem, wrote a piece that for all of the students in the audience, I would highly recommend you read, that was about a 5,000 to 10,000 word piece in the Washington Post that ran last Sunday, that was making the argument that one of the core threats the U.S. Faces, which touches all of these issues, is between liberalism and authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. And that the authoritarian toolkit, mainly by managing and owning and mining and controlling the digital space, is becoming more sophisticated. It's becoming harder to control and get our heads around. And that, to me, when I think forward to the next 25 years, when we have this conference 25 years from now, will probably be the most profound threat that we were going to look back upon that we've either faced or not.
All right, Juliette?
So I've spent my career in Homeland Security, so I am going to focus on climate change as sort of the more existential, no immediate moment, no attack, no election, but sustainable. One is just clearly, why do wars start, right? The fight for limited resources, fresh water, your children can't live, clean air, all, and so the fight for resources, and then the impact of climate change on migration and the movement of people as they search areas that are inhabitable. So you're going to have disruption in the international space, then bring it back to the US. The way we have built ourselves in terms of critical infrastructure and where we have allowed people to live and how they live is just not sustainable given the numbers that we're seeing in terms of water rise or drought or flooding as we're seeing around here, or fires in California. And that's going to, I think, have tremendous challenges in terms of governance and stability, even in the United States, let alone, can we sustain $1 billion plus disaster every month now? Every month, right?
So I'm going to focus on cyber threats as well. After all, it's the field that I work in and write about primarily. There are a lot of worrisome characteristics to cyber threats. In the interest of brevity, I'll just emphasize two of them to start us off. One is the reality that they have brought forth in terms of the permanent residency of our opponents in our most vital infrastructures, in the economy, in our government, in our political systems more broadly, even in our military. Because it has to do with the enormous complications of doing defense in the still fairly new, from a broad historical standpoint, domain of conflict. So we could debate the numbers on this, but roughly speaking, there's about between 80 to 90% of cyber threats that can be neutralized with some fairly basic defensive measures, right? But there's this upper threshold, right, of capabilities, say 10% or so. And here I'm referring to your most capable state adversaries, where you have to assume, right, that they're going to be able to penetrate your most prized domestic terrain, right? And that means that this is a very significant reversal of the classical security paradigm, which was traditionally about keeping your adversary outside of your domestic terrain. from a cybersecurity standpoint, you have to start from the assumption that at least your most capable adversaries are already inside. And what that means is that the main challenge of cybersecurity is not how to keep your adversary outside, but rather how to diminish his ability to cause you harm from within. That's one very worrisome element. Another one that I want to emphasize is what the cyber threat means for the changing character of force. Right? Because information has now become force in the purest sense. So Carl von Clausewitz thought and wrote about information as a source of power, right? In the sense that if you have knowledge of your adversary's intentions and capabilities, then that can enable you to thwart those intentions. But now information has become force itself in the sense that zeros and ones, right? All computer code reduces to zeros and ones, which is basically information stored as electrons, can be used to inflict direct harm upon the physical world. And so when you tie these two elements that I've identified together, what we're dealing with is a situation in which information as force resides permanently and mostly surreptitiously inside our prized terrain. And those are two major challenges.
All right, something cheerful now, or?
Well, in my career, I've worked in the most open of institutions, in the Congress, for Congressman Hamilton, a real high point in my life. And I've worked in the most closed of institutions, the intelligence community. And so I'd like to make two comments, but frankly with the greater emphasis on the former, and that is that the greatest challenge we face in national security, in my view, is simply the engagement and support of the American public for America's role in world affairs. There is not a problem we can solve satisfactorily, sometimes not at all, without deep engagement with friends, partners, yes, and sometimes with adversaries. We may tell ourselves we're the world's biggest, strongest military power. Maybe we're still the biggest economy, maybe not with China. And we're an immensely powerful and productive country, but unless our public supports our engagement, we can't solve any of the problems that have been discussed here. So that's from the open world, and the one I deeply believe in. The second one is from my time at the National Intelligence Council, where we're always looking over the horizon at what is the next threat, the next challenge, 5, 10, 20 years away. Well, cyber is very much the threat of today. Let me make your life more complicated. Think about quantum computing. Don't ask me to explain that because I would embarrass myself. But China is deeply interested in it because of Edward Snowden. And it saw that the United States was deeply within its information networks. And so they looked to quantum computing and quantum encryption to defeat efforts of the United States in particular to gain intelligence on China. But it's more than that. If you can achieve success with quantum computing, it will be a level of computing power that far exceeds anything we have today, and has direct military applications that can defeat stealth technology, can find nuclear submarines hidden in the oceans. And let's be clear, some of this is quite speculative, and China is putting a great deal of money into quantum computing, as is the United States. And we don't know exactly where they are in their developments, but certainly over the time horizon of the next 10 to 20 years, it could make an enormous difference in the safety and security of this country and in the strategic balance as we know it.
Okay, I feel cheered. So let's just follow on with that for a moment about China. So certainly in the university environment, we're hearing about China every single day. You know, not a day goes by we don't have somebody from some government agency visiting saying, what are you doing with China? And are you providing data to China? And we always have to remind them we actually publish data, and therefore we are giving it to China just like we give it to everyone. And in fact, we have a federal mandate that we do that. So we would violate federal law if we were to stop. So the question I really want to ask is how great of a threat is China? But how much should we worry about China as opposed to less visible, less clearly identified, or more diffuse threats?
Well, let's start with casting some old assumptions aside. Because
Okay.
I think there was
Yeah, let's have new assumptions.
There was a virtual assumption embedded in our policy toward China for, well, I don't know, 20, 30 years, that China was going to evolve and become more pluralistic and eventually democratic. Now, this may sound rather naive to those of you who are now in your undergraduate years, but that was a governing assumption. And I think that that's gone now. I think we are dealing with, Derek talked about this new authoritarian danger. That is where China is Exhibit A. And I think that getting to clarity on that took a long time. And now I think we need to get more operational about exactly what that means. This is new territory. We are in the post-end of history world. And the idea that simply by increasing China's voice in international institutions and participating in the WTO, et cetera, that this was going to be a fundamentally transformative experience, it's just not right. And I don't want to talk too much about the implications of that, but we have a new awareness of a pretty serious problem.
I agree with that. I think that in part it reflects a shift within China. A decade or so ago, when I was serving the Obama administration, and the big strategic move at the time for the Obama administration was the so-called rebalance to Asia, which was to try to put more diplomatic, economic, military bandwidth of the United States into the Asia Pacific to deal with the rise of China and other things going on in Asia. But the framework was very much embedded within this worldview that Todd accurately describes, which actually was a bipartisan worldview. It probably was best summed up by a former George W. Bush appointee, Bob Zellick, the responsible stakeholder view. That China, we weren't going to try to stop China's rise, but that China, we wanted to encourage them to be a responsible stakeholder in the international system, working with us on issues of common interest. But it was in part motivated by a sense of what China's ambition was. And the thought was, at the time, which I think is proven to be either wrong at the time or it's just changed within China, that China's ambition was to kind of bide its time, to keep a low profile, pretty modest. And now I think we see across the board China that is engaged in much more meaningful competition with the United States across a range of issues. And that China, a decade ago, the rap was that they were not particularly good at innovating, they were just good at copying. Well, they were very good at copying, but now, particularly when it comes to AI or quantum computing, they are innovating and they are leading the pack, and they want to define the future of artificial intelligence, and this is an area where we now are playing from behind. When you look in the military space, there is a concerted effort on the part of the PLA, the Chinese military, to not just offset US military advantages, but to gain advantage on the United States militarily to reduce our ability to protect our interests, our friends in the Asia Pacific. And then also obviously economically, if you look at the transatlantic relationship, US-European relations, one of the big disputes we're having right now with the Europeans is over their engagement with China, whether it's concerns about Chinese investment in European infrastructure, whether that's hard infrastructure like ports, and the Chinese president will be visiting Italy, I think, tomorrow, and one of the things they'll announce is a major Chinese investment in a port in Italy as part of their Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, but also China's investment in Europe's digital infrastructure, particularly the 5G network, which has been something that the Trump administration has made a lot of noise in terms of concerns that I agree with, and where Europe is divided. And how that plays out will very much define the concerns that Chris has laid out in terms of how the future will be defined in terms of the digital space.
So to what extent do we, a skeptic would ask, to what extent, it feels like some of these concerns are really more concerns about economic competitiveness. And the 5G always raises this question. Is this just because we're not as good at this, or is this because they're actually using a network in a way that threatens national security? And even in the pressure that I think universities have faced, sometimes it's couched in terms of protecting intellectual property, which is, again, something universities don't really do ever, much less well. And sometimes it's cast in very national security terms. Are those fair distinctions, or is this really all national security?
So, if I may, I think it is a fair distinction, but I think a misguided one when one looks at what the potential evolution of the Chinese cyber threat, information threat, could be. And here I'm particularly concerned about the Chinese cyber threat acquiring Russian characteristics. Yes. What do I mean by that? So far, as we've already begun to discuss, the main Chinese cyber threat has been one of intellectual property theft, right? So they're the main culprits in General Keith Alexander's famous comment about cyber espionage representing the greatest theft in human history, right? The Chinese are the world masters when it comes to using the vast surface and expanding surface of cyberspace to seize industrial, economic, even material secrets. I mean, one of the greatest examples of this is the seizure of some parts of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter designs, information with which the Chinese then went on and built the J-31, which according to some accounts is aerodynamically superior in the F-30. And they did it at much more quickly and at a much lower cost than the Americans and their allies did, right, in coming up with the F-35. What they haven't done so far in cyberspace is political disruption of the Russian kind, right? So the Russians have a very different manifestation of the cyber threat because they use the internet primarily, right, as a means to disrupt and disorient adversaries, mainly liberal democratic adversaries, seizing the asymmetric advantages that they have as a closed society and that we suffer in terms of being more open and therefore more inherently manipulable information spaces. So what I worry about is considering that the Chinese also have a very highly evolved and capable state apparatus for information control, right, domestically. Right, so they train it upon their own citizens. What worries me is that those capabilities will be transferred to applications abroad. Right? So I can imagine easily as the geopolitical contentions between China and the West, perhaps especially with the United States, intensify over the coming years or decades, that there will be a greater perceived gain or need in Beijing to use cyberspace to disrupt and weaken, right, Western political systems, taking more than one page from the Russian Manual of Information Warfare.
So just to follow up on this, one of the things that the most recent Worldwide Threat Assessment talks about in some detail is not so much new alignments, but strengthened or intensified alignments. And one they talk about is, of course, China and Russia. They talk about Iran and North Korea. Are these types of alignments something that we've always worried about these to some extent, but is there new reason to worry? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, the Chinese and the Russians and a few other autocratic regimes have, in fact, been quite closely aligned when it comes to information control. Primarily, the main organizational vehicle for this has been the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is a formal setting that the Russians and the Chinese and their autocratic allies have used to come up with things like formal agreements on how to do information security, right, which is the term of art for information control domestically. Right, primarily, of course, in order to ensure the survival of the regimes in those countries. So there already is, right, a sort of best practices cooperation between Moscow and Beijing in precisely this area of concern.
I think to the extent, so if you think about not transnational, or not nation-to-nation threats, but the borderless threats that sort of I spent a lot of time worried about. So the four biggest challenges from the U.S. perspective are they're not state-based are going to be clearly terrorism, and New Zealand is a reminder that there's a new, unfortunately, a new old kid on the block, but the sort of terrorism, climate change, as I said before, cyber, and the capacity of not just a state but others disrupting, and then of course pandemics, which we don't talk enough about as a national security issue. But when the World Health Organization tells us that the anti-vax movement is one of the top 10 concerns because were talking about measles in 2019, you know, we're in a very different age, right, where science and data are not driving human behavior. So if you think about these challenges and then China and how that relates. So the United States in the security world and in this complicated network of security standards, the United States traditionally had always set the floor. We had aviation security, cargo security, airport security, screening security, border security, we set the floor, which would not just protect us, but presumably isolate any threats that we could have. You may love it or you may hate it. You may have hated the post 9/11 stuff, but nonetheless, other countries, including China, followed that order. We have now changed, you know, we're sort of not less interested in setting the standards of that floor or setting that international standard. So the thing that concerns me is China, there may be a new floor setter, which may be lower, and therefore increase the vulnerabilities or you know, to the United States, or it might be higher, depending, or it might have standards that we don't particularly like the definition of a terrorist and who you're able to take from another country. So just thinking about our decision to withdraw from not just criticizing NATO or the UN, but literally just withdrawing from that sort of table setting, which has protected us remarkably in particular in the sort of borderless threat front. China will come in. And then just to your point, which is just a great point to remember, the political side of China's influence may not happen 2020, but maybe 2022 and 2024. And for students, we tend to think of this as being, oh, this is on the networks, we'll protect our election networks. The thing I'm most worried about from election security side, probably the Russians in 2020, anyone else, is not the changing of the vote, is not the fake news. It is, how do I win Michigan for the more authoritarian candidate? How do I win it? Students, how would you do that? Minimize Detroit's vote. And how do I do that? Fake news about an active shooter. Fake news about the freeways being closed, right? Populations that have a limited amount of time to vote. And so that nexus between the physical vulnerabilities that we may or may not have and the ability to use fake news is actually, I think, the next front, not just in Russia, but in other countries sort of coming in. And you get 20,000 African Americans not to vote in Detroit, and I've delivered Michigan for you.
So I have a slightly different understanding of the Russian political threat when it comes to 2020, if I may. So, and we have to understand what the Russians were up to in 2016. Right? Yes, they certainly had a demonstrable preference for Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton. Right? I think that's quite clear in terms of the social media campaigns that they had prepared, anticipating, like much of the rest of this country and the world, Clinton's victory in November. Now, but that's not their primary aim. In my understanding, the primary aim of Russian political disruption through information warfare is to sow division and discord within the adversary's political systems in order to weaken the adversary from within, to weaken its foreign policy assertiveness. So when I think of 2020, and I think of, for example, Trump's former lawyer Cohen's comments before the Congress saying that yes, that if in 2020 President Trump loses the election, and I'm thinking about that, and if I agree with that assumption in Moscow, then perhaps what I want to do is to orchestrate as best as I can, and insofar as I can, a Trump loss, because that's what's going to weaken the U.S. political system even further.
I think that is, I had never thought about that before. I find it hard to believe that, I mean, this is just sort of if you're Putin, that you would favor, let me put it this way, that's a gamble for them, right? Because you'd have to both assume that the Democrat would win, but also that Putin, that Trump, so that was weird, that Trump wouldn't leave. This idea that sort of was part of the narrative that we have to stop the Russians doing from what they're doing, because if it's not Trump today, it will be a Democrat tomorrow. I just don't buy it. I mean, I think that Putin is always, and you saw it across Europe and you see it elsewhere, that in Latin America and South America, he will always favor the more authoritarian candidate. But your scenario is, I had something I had not thought about, that would be a way to get everyone to the streets.
It's essentially an opportunistic.
Right. Yeah.
Which is just to say, no matter how depressed we are, we can come up with something
Yeah.
even
we
more
Yeah.
depressing to help.
That's our
move
job.
this
Right.
Yeah,
along.
I can
We've only just gotten
disenfranchise
started, right?
20,000
I know.
voters.
Don't
and he
try to
can-
outdo him,
Yeah,
really.
exactly.
It's all right. So let me just tell you, we are going to get to your questions, so you should be thinking of those. We're just not going to get to them quite yet. We've just got a few more things to cover here. So one topic I'd like to come back to is the digital space. And particularly, this may be stating the obvious, but why is the digital space such an opportunity? Why has it moved over the past decade to the kind of head of most people's lists when they start talking about global threats?
I mean, I was looking for my smartphone just to hold it up, but I think that's part of it. I mean, it's a big part
It's
of it, right? By 2020, there are going to be as much as 30 billion devices connected to the internet. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And that's
like
not
a low estimate, but
it's a low. Perhaps that's low. So that's just not our
Do you mean in my house?
our
'Cause I
iPhones,
sometimes
but that's
feel
the thing.
like-
But that's also the point. It's Alexa.
I mean, your
it's-
house alone
it's
might have
our
100 connected
right,
devices.
Right, so that's okay.
including
So
things like the salt
so
shaker
if you
and
think about it,
fridge.
I heard this great term or read this great term, postmodern authoritarianism. Which, if you think about all the information that's being vacuumed up by those 30 billion or more devices, and the ability to mine that information, to use it, to manipulate it, whoever can do that is going to hold the upper hand. And this is where the authoritarian argument or concern comes in. Because authoritarian regimes, China, Russia, others, they don't worry so much about privacy. They don't worry about liberal values. They don't worry about the difficult trade-offs that are really hard problems for democratic policymakers to work through. And so it seems to me that's why the digital space, I mean, as our lives are changing and as we are giving ourselves more and more over to the digital space, right? In many ways for convenience, for safety, for more information, we are also exposing ourselves to extremely, extremely nefarious forces and actors.
But it seems like then this is going to get even worse because we're just headed down that road, right? We can't secure these devices, so we have new devices we can't secure. We can't secure the technologies we're now using, so we're going to put them in our cars so that they control our cars, where we also won't be able to secure them. Is there a sense in which this is really sort of self-immolation as opposed to more of a not being sufficiently resistant to threats from someplace else?
Hey, here's the problem. If you're the craziest person out of 1 million people, we now have the means of getting you in touch with the 380 Americans who are just as crazy as you are, and that's just the United States.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And this horror in New Zealand is unthinkable in the absence of digital media and social media. It enabled it. It was broadcast, and this is new. We had a capacity. We didn't really even realize it was a capacity, but we had a capacity of keeping extreme fringe views apart, and that's gone.
So Christopher, this seems to sort of add greater weight or terror to the point you were making about a informed population that would be willing to act if in fact we're this vulnerable from within.
Well, I guess I would answer that, also getting back to your China question, that the involvement of American voters and citizens in support of their country's engagement is the only way we can seek to address these problems writ large. And with China in particular, you know, the United States has a wonderful record of building alliances and partnerships to establish international norms and standards everywhere. And we benefit from that. And you can bet that if we walk away, China will fill that void because it can. And to my second point, you know, how do we deal with the cyber challenges and the other challenges I spoke to? It requires very significant investment by the federal government in support of basic research and sciences, because China is marching and putting vast resources into these areas, and we need to match that to gain that digital upper hand in this world of the future, because if we don't have that capability, the authoritarians will. So I'll stop there.
So it seems like many of the threats we're talking about, borders become less relevant, irrelevant, either because the dangers from within, domestic terrorism or climate change, it doesn't respect borders at all, or because the border's already been breached. If it's Russia or China, whoever, they're already here in digital devices or other forms. So how should this alter our responses as we think as a nation about global challenges?
I think about borders a lot from the home. So I think what we have to remember is all the bad things you just mentioned. I have 1 million people lawfully crossing the US-Mexico border every week, and that's a good thing. I have 1 million people domestically up in the sky right now, and in 12 hours it will be different 1 million people, and we're not talking about it. It's a good thing. And so I think the challenge is how do you, what we call how do you maximize the secure flow of people, goods, ideas, networks? It's the flow part. Security's easy. I mean, I'm in the world. I got a wall, I'll give you a wall. I won't have the Boston Marathon if you're worried about marathon security. So I think what we have to do is figure out, and this is to your wonderful point about engagement, getting the public to accept a level of risk for the benefit of the secure flow. So the average Custom and Border Protection agent runs into an unlawful immigrant, you wouldn't know this from the media, every 14 days. That's a problem, it's not a crisis, right? So in other words, that's just risk, but it's not a huge risk. And so beginning to be able to talk rationally about our vulnerabilities are actually good because of the 1 million people, X, Y, Z. And that's gonna take a lot of education, because what's politically seems beneficial is I can promise you a no-risk border. That is, you don't want it, because I want 1 million people crossing it every week. So that's just gonna be, I think, a lot of engagement on educating about acceptable risk.
Lucas, can I just ask you to follow up on this? Would you agree with that assessment in the cyberspace world that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to dispel a common misconception, which is that cyberspace or the internet is some sort of magical environment where people can enter to escape their sovereigns. That's not quite true, as the Russian and Chinese experiments in information control increasingly demonstrate, because cyberspace has, importantly, a physical layer to it, right, comprising routers and servers, and that physical layer resides in territorial space, and therefore it's subject to the jurisdictional controls of governments, right? And again, the Russians and the Chinese understand this very well, which is why they've been so effective at developing their own regimes of information control. But the internet, especially from the original, perhaps somewhat utopian conception here in the West, as an open space of information exchange where there isn't, right, a highly controlled regime for information flow, because that sort of a regime in many ways and rightly would be repulsive to our basic values as open societies, right? That's a problem, and it's important to understand that there's a technological determinant to this issue, which is that when one looks at the way that the internet communications protocols, right, were designed, and in fact changed in the 1970s and 80s. What one sees is that there was a prioritization of the flow and the delivery of packets of data, right? It was important to get your packets of data from point A to point B, wherever those points might be. So the resiliency of the system was the #1 priority. What was not prioritized was 2 aspects of security: authenticating the identity of the sender of those packets and authenticating the content of the packets, right? And so now we're in the system where those communications protocols, TCP/IP, have become firmly established. And yes, an engineer will tell you that anything can be re-engineered and changed. It's just a question of, can you pay for it? And clearly we can't pay for it, right? But when one looks at those early design decisions in the evolution of the internet, one sees that we're now in a situation where we can't, right, feasibly change, reprioritize those characteristics of the internet. And I think when one returns to the question of the expansion of the internet into the internet of things, or perhaps more appropriately, the internet of everything, right, this problem is only going to become more compounded.
And that was the good news. So just before we go to audience questions, I just want to spend 1 minute on, if you will, non-technical or technological threats. And so, Juliette, you mentioned climate change. So if we think about climate change, migration, civil unrest, pandemics, I mean, these could all obviously be related to each other as well as to technologies. I understand that. But are these, are we not paying enough attention to these issues? Is that a shared view, or are we?
I mean, could someone explain what the U.S. approach to climate change is right now? The official U.S. government approach? I mean, I think this goes back to Chris's very first point, which is whether or not we can rise to this challenge. The Soviet Union was a pretty big challenge, right? Nuclear holocaust was a sobering thing for folks at conferences like this to get their heads around in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. We rose to that challenge. But when we look at the confluence of threats that we are facing, whether it's man-made things like the digital sphere, whether it's acts of God, perhaps promoted by some man-made decisions like weather events, these are frightening things, and these are issues that it's not going to take only one country to solve, and it's not going to be solved anytime soon. And it seems to me that what's perhaps so tragic about our current moment is that we're missing a huge opportunity. And it's an opportunity we may not get back. Yeah. And it's not just the cause is not just one person. I mean, I think that one person has a lot to do with it, but it's not just one person. It goes back to the panel before lunch, which was on the Congress.
Their fault.
Well, no, the Congress and our political system, and whether or not we can have a sober view of what threats really are, and what acceptable risk looks like, and whether there is a sense of accountability in our system, whether we have an educated population, an educated citizenry that's ready to engage with these issues, either professionally or just as common voters. That, to me, is, I mean, I agree with Chris. I hadn't thought of it before he said this, but that's the biggest challenge, because if we can kind of get ourselves together, we can. I'm confident. I try to remain fundamentally an optimistic person that we can continue to find what has brought the U.S. to this point of success that few people would have predicted decades ago, given the state of the world. But I do wonder whether, at this moment, whether we've got it in us.
You should try pessimism. It at least leaves open the possibility that you'll be
wrong. Right, that's right, fair point.
We may have reached the absolute low point of this panel now. I do want to provide a chance. Okay, we're going to get to as many of you as possible. So can we just start here on the far right? Yeah.
All right. Hi, my name's Maura. I'm a junior studying law and public policy. And my question has to do with the fact that you all talked a lot about cyber and digital and not a lot of conventional forces. And then you also spoke on the political will of the American public to do something about the issues with the military. So my question for you is, do you think the American public would be more open to divest from conventional military I can't think of a word right now, things is what I'm going to go with, into more cyber aspects? And if you think the American public would be more open to it, do you think the military-industrial complex would?
I'll take a first swing at that, yes. I mean, I think you're seeing, obviously the United States is still going to maintain a large military in terms of human beings who serve in uniform. We're still going to fly a lot of planes, drive a lot of tanks, have a lot of wheeled vehicles. But if you look at, really for the last decade, the priority for the Defense Department, including into this administration, has been to slowly turn things into the fight of the future, which will be fought in the digital space, we fight by smart weapons. I mean, this brings up a lot of really tough policy challenges, ethical issues that the Department of Defense and those who think about these issues full-time are worrying about. I do think that there's room for investment in this. I mean, if you look at just the defense budgets over the last, not just room, support for this investment, you look at the defense budgets for the last decade, you're certainly seeing a trend to investing more into the forces of the future. You're seeing the military innovate in ways, creating new cyber commands, thinking of cyber as a military domain. Somebody pointed out to me that it was about 5,000 years ago when we started to fight on the ground. 4,000 years ago, we started to fight in the maritime space. About a century ago, we started to fight in the air. And it's been a decade or two that we've fought in cyber. Mm-hmm. So it's still a relatively young domain when it comes to military conflict. So there's still a lot to learn, and there's still a lot of adaptation to come. But you mentioned defense industry. There's no question defense industry is racing into this space. And just as they did during the early Cold War days, they are setting a pacing function in terms of innovation and development. And that's something the federal government's encouraging.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up to that to whoever wants it? But I appreciate you're the optimist of the panel, but look, even I don't buy this level of optimism. In other words, the challenge seems to be escalating so fast, moving so fast, and we've got a military that takes 20 years to build a plane. It seems like a mismatch. And moreover, we've had, these challenges, I can remember 5 years ago, we had the president of the largest financial services company in the United States here. Somebody said, what is it you worry about? Expecting him to say, the market crashing or things like that. And he said cyber attacks. But then he went on to say, because I get no help whatsoever from the government. That, if somebody comes and attacks my headquarters, I'll have the police, I'll have the National Guard, the government will be there, but my network gets attacked 5,000 times a second and I get zero help from the government. Does anyone see that changing?
So, unfortunately, no, at least not anytime soon. And I think the root of the problem has to do with the reality that our strategic and doctrinal understandings when it comes to cyber issues here in the West lag far behind the level of understanding in places like Russia or China. Right? So in reference to the young lady's question, the Russians know, this is a starting assumption of their current security strategy, that they cannot win a conventional conflict, right, with the United States and its Western allies. Right? That was not true for much of the Cold War. It is pretty much unquestionably true today. So what they have done is they've adapted their strategy in ways that emphasize information warfare, because that's where there exists asymmetrical advantages for the Russians over the West. Right? So there's, for example, an important defensive advantage. Right? You want to do information warfare against within the Russian political system. Well, that's can be quite hard to do, because 80% or so of Russian citizens obtain their news primarily from television, which is state-controlled, and not from the internet, right? Whereas here in our open societies, right, we're much more reliant on the internet as a source of information or misinformation, right? And we don't have, right, it's clearly a tightly controlled apparatus of information control, nor do we really want to create one. Right? So, and the Russians, it's important to emphasize, have been thinking about principles of offense and defense in the information space since at least the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917. You could probably go back earlier and look at what the Tsarist Akhrana, the secret police, had been doing even before then. Right? So none of this is new. It may seem new to us what they did in 2016. Right, in terms of the hacking of the Democratic Party leadership's emails, then the release of those emails 3 days before the Democratic Party convention, and creating all kinds of political turmoil that still persists today. It may seem new to us. It's certainly not true from a doctrinal standpoint. And so what the Russians have done very ably, unfortunately for us, is adapted those principles, those precepts of information warfare into the new and growing opportunities for maneuver in cyberspace. So if I were to advise, right, the administration in this country and the administration of its Western allies, I'm very much worried about the country that I live in, right, Britain, and also more broadly this political situation in Europe. My advice would be, if I had to choose, I'd say don't focus so much on developing conventional military capabilities, nor even necessarily on developing offensive cyber arsenals, right? because we already, my understanding is, have an edge there, but rather focus on developing and adapting and updating our strategic concepts when it comes to this new form of conflict. New for us, right?
Okay, so let's go next there. Yeah, we'll just, oh, right. Yeah, just keep the microphone and then we'll just go on over there. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nathan Ryder. I study international studies, GSG, and conflict. I'm actually a student of Tom Lidberg. Sorry I wasn't in class today.
Me too.
With a
It's
panel
got
like
guts anyway. Yeah.
with a panel like this, how could I not ask about ISIS? So let me preface it with the last crumbling strongholds ISIS has in Iraq. I see analysts point out that they will still be a threat, whether it's ISIS as is or a splinter group from it. We're seeing a balloon effect rise in Islamic State involvement from Iraq to now North African Maghreb and Tajikistan. So my question is, after 2 decades fighting terror, is there even an appetite for America to expand our involvement into North Africa or Tajikistan? What would that involvement look like?
Yes.
You go first.
Well, I'm happy to speak to that question because Congressman Hamilton and Governor Kaine have been involved in a task force looking at this very question. We've been whacking terrorists for a long time, killing a lot of them, and there's nothing bad about killing bad guys. Mm-hmm. But terrorism has spread from Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda to ISIS to North Africa and the Sahel and on and on. So we need a new approach as a government, and that is we need to make prevention our hallmark and our key word. And that is to work with fragile states and troubled societies and help them address their problems of governance, often security force repression. We need to work on economic development and helping fragile societies to address their own problems of indigenous development of violent extremism. Because a military solution, we've spent a lot of money over many years, and we sure haven't solved the problem of terrorism. So we've got to help societies be resilient. Why is this a good idea? Because it costs a lot less than the use of force. It's economical in terms of blood and treasure. And if you're concerned about Russia and China and authoritarians, you've got to refocus and not devote all of your attention to military solutions to terrorism. And finally, what's important here is that this doesn't mean that the United States doesn't address imminent threats. We have that ability. We can and we should. But we need to be engaged in helping fragile societies around the world do a better job addressing these problems so that terrorism doesn't arise across the 50 countries of North Africa, the Middle East, and the Sahel.
Let me just add one. I'm sorry.
Sure.
No, I just conceptually how, because of this, this is a long approach and absolutely right. Conceptually, what's changed on the defense side is an orientation because of the nature of the ISIS threat. So Al-Qaeda, you want to stop 19 guys from getting on 4 airplanes again. Okay, that's a warlike approach, right? So then you have the metamorphosis of terrorism, a certain kind of terrorism, that we've called lone wolf or whack-a-mole, but nonetheless is very hard to stop. So on the defense side, we've oriented from what we call left of boom, right? Boom being the ISIS attack, it could be anything, to also expending a lot in Europe and the United States on right of boom capabilities, because I'll tell you a success story in counter-terrorism is, yes, 3 people died at the Boston Marathon finish line, 297 who lost arms, legs, fingers, limbs, whatever, did not die because of the right of boom response capabilities that we've nurtured in the United States. That's a crude way of putting it. But the more that we can also minimize the impact of a of a threat that is almost impossible to get to zero, because we want to focus on the prevention issues. In the homeland side, also a recognition: can we begin to measure success not by whether something bad happened, but whether fewer people died, because it's so hard to make it to stop all the things from happening.
I just wanted to add to what Chris said, which is that in this endeavor of trying to think about how to build capabilities abroad, we will have plenty of partners. The German government just did a white paper on civilian protection and security, and they're very eager to move into this area. One of the reasons, frankly, is they admitted 1 million refugees, and they found that to be very disruptive. And I don't think that's something that they would relish facing the need to do again. So you can, if you want a really sort of brutally national interest focused approach to this, I mean, that's something that can appeal to people. That's not necessarily how I think of refugees and migrants, but that is how some people do. And this is an area where we can probably use as much as we can muster.
Just 2 sentences to add. Prevention is such a powerful approach because we will have so many international partners who will join us, partners who, frankly, don't always support our use of force, to put it mildly, and have real doubts about drone strikes. But we're going to have a lot of partners for a prevention agenda.
Okay, right there. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is James Romano. I'm a freshman here studying international law. So I have the privilege to be in Mr. Lindbergh's class as well. And we were talking in a...
Did you attend?
I was at the conference.
Okay.
How many people were in class today, Todd?
It seemed like a pretty good crowd. So they're here now.
We were in a small discussion, and he touched on it earlier in the discussion today, but that these spaces of radicalization where you will have one person in a million being able to connect to the other 380 people who would have been separated by hundreds of thousands of miles in other times. How do we approach these like spaces of radicalization without opting to the authoritarian model that we see in Russia with censorship, or the in China with the Orwellian social score system that we wouldn't have even anticipated even 5 years ago?
I explained that in class.
Obviously not well enough.
No one was there. No one was there.
Actually, no, I'll start off. I don't know. And that is a big problem. You know, there is a, we don't want to be like them. And we need our open system. But we do not have the capability to disrupt, at least so far we don't have the capability to disrupt this sort of nefarious use of this amazing resource. And what do you got, Derek?
Well, I was just going to pose a question back, because this is what going back to ISIL, where, you know, as President Trump reminded us yesterday with the map, we are close to breaking the back of ISIL. They're not going to go away, but militarily, they've been diminished significantly. That's not just because the U.S. military and its partners has taken bad guys off the battlefield. It's also because it has fought a vigorous campaign in the digital space. And it perhaps, and maybe I could be corrected here, but perhaps there's some lessons to learn from that fight that was started up out of nothing during the Obama administration in 2014 and was carried forward to today, that can be applied to the threat that you're talking about, which I think, going back to this, Juliette's point, which is we're never going to fully 100% keep all this in the box. But it's a way we're going to mitigate it, the way we can take down things quickly. The awareness of these things, I think, is something we can increase. But anyway, perhaps there's some lessons learned in progress we've made right now in ISIL, where, again, going back 5 years ago, the problem seemed almost insurmountable at the time, and yet we've gotten to the point where we're on the cusp of a major breakthrough, it seems to me.
But isn't this the virtually, I'm just going to say virtually so I won't be immediately proven wrong, unique aspect about the types of challenges we're seeing now, which is when we think about, you know, building a tank or building a weapon or whatever, the only thing you had to get the public to do was agree to pay for it. There was no other real internal sacrifice. When we talk about things like cybersecurity, like using the internet for these radicalization purposes, the public is the user of this stuff. And so every time Facebook says, we've hired another 1,000 people to screen messages, some of those messages are ours. It's not just the 1 in 300 million radical. Or when we talk about maybe we shouldn't deploy a technology because we can't secure it right now, well, that's my car that's not going to have that technology. It's not a tank someplace in a battlefield. Are we going to, I mean, I guess this comes back, Chris, really to where you started. Are we ever going to have public support for what might be trivial but tangible self-sacrifice in this fight?
Well, you've directed that at me, so. I guess what I'd say is Derek is absolutely right that when it comes with respect to international terrorism, we have legal authorities as a government to do lots of really important and pretty blunt things in terms of the internet with response to terrorism. The real challenge that I see is the one of domestic terrorism. And it was referenced earlier, white supremacists or whatever the domestic grievance is that normally is protected by the First Amendment. And speech, even hate speech, unless there's an imminent link to violence, is protected by the First Amendment. So what do we do there? Well, you know, these internet companies, these platforms, they're pretty powerful companies. And they have terms of service agreements. As private corporations, they can and do live by a different standard than the First Amendment. So it comes back to these companies with lots of public pressure and embarrassing hearings, oversight hearings before the Congress, where they are pressed to take more action under terms of service agreements that, frankly, do things that the United States government cannot do because of the First Amendment.
Can I just add to that on Zuckerberg sort of, I mean, Facebook convinced us, right, for much of its history, that it had no agency, right? That in other words, it was bound by the First Amendment, right? So I don't want to control speech. You often heard Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook executives say that, I don't want to control speech. So that statement was a choice, right? Because they do have agency. And the thing that's shocking to me, and I've totally switched on Facebook from thinking it's, benign neglect to something much worse about what's going on Facebook is, someone was killing lots of people on FaceTime Live on Friday, and tell me how their metrics did not pick up a live gunshot. I know there's technology there that can do it. Or the image of a moving gun, or the sounds of screams for 17 minutes. This is now something that, the apology tour is over. We need to get everyone engaged because the failures have brewed this stuff. The second thing I'll just quickly say is, let's not also forget the public space and the shaming factor that we seem to have lost for certain ideologies to not be given voice, even though we know they still exist because hatred and anti-Semitism and Nazism and Islamophobia have existed, unfortunately, for all time, but that the intensity by which the bad thoughts are given sort of a runway today. And it may not be from the White House, but urging our political leaders, governors, mayors, others, to not allow that behavior to be acceptable. I want the guys in Charleston to have their hoods back on. I do, right? I mean, that to me is a sign of a good society. The fact that they felt empowered, or Charles felt empowered to not wear hoods, was a bad sign,
You said you wanted to.
Yeah, so there are a number of important points here. I mean, one doesn't need to assume sinister intentions, right, on behalf of the executives at Facebook to realize what kind of a problem this is, right? Because one of the most striking things about the aftermath of the 2016 social media campaigns, largely misinformation campaigns conducted by Russian groups, right? And also in 2014 in the lead up to the Brexit referendum in the UK, is how little Facebook executives and technicians seemed to understand about what was going on inside their own social media platforms. So they're the owners, they're the operators, right? They're the designers of these platforms. And even they didn't quite seem to be able to detect, right, these sorts of nefarious information activities. But even if a company like Facebook does know what's going on, it may choose, this is returning to your question, to not cooperate, right, with government authorities, right? Because its interests may clash with the interests of the government. And I think in this regard, the Apple FBI contention of 2015 is very instructive, right? So I'm thinking about the case of the San Bernardino shooting in California, right, where we had two domestically based ISIS-inspired individuals who went on a shooting spree, and then the FBI presented Apple with an order to decrypt one of the terrorist iPhones, right, to find out if there were, find out more about the operation and to see if there were other individuals tied to it. And famously, Tim Cook of Apple replied in two blog posts and in other statements that no, Apple wouldn't do this because if it did so, it would undermine the entire encryption regime of the iPhone ecosystem. So you had quite extraordinarily, for at least a moment, you had a multinational company dictating to the most powerful government in the world which of two seemingly incompatible goods should prevail: protection against terrorism or the protection of privacy. And in the end, what happened is, the story goes, that the FBI, the US government, turned to a small Israeli company to decrypt the phone. Now, that may have been a victory for the US government in this particular case, when one looks at the larger question of the relationship of the private industry and the government in the national security space. It was a victory for private industry, right? And so in terms of that bigger picture, I can't think of another time in history where private industry, and in our times, the technology companies, has played such an important role in the provision of national security as in our own times. And that's worrisome, and that's just highly disruptive of our national security thinking.
Okay, so I'm going to go to the other side of the aisle in the interest of bipartisanship here, if I can. Is there a microphone on this side? Oh, look at that. It's perfect. Why don't we start on the wall there? Thank you very much.
You're on.
You're okay.
You're okay.
Hi, my name is Krishna. I'm a senior studying public policy. I wanted to ask about emerging technology and sort of the globalization aspect of it. So like ARPANET, the internet precursor, and the Manhattan Project had French, British, and Canadian collaboration. But with respect to emerging technology like artificial intelligence, nanotech, biotech, how can we avoid nationalizing the innovation stream, sort of doing it on our own, and collaborate effectively with countries like China, but at the same time protect our national security while doing so? Because it seems like, as we say, it's time for the US to show leadership in AI. China says it's time for us to show leadership in AI. There should be some collaboration with regards to norms and governance, it seems. So what's the balance?
Well, let me try on that. Well, in one sense, we do it all the time. Science and technology is an international endeavor. I mean, all science and technology has international participation. A lot of Chinese participate in projects here at IU and at every major research university. So the question is you want to promote it because it's in our interest to collaborate. At the same time, you've got to wall off and protect what you need to do. And I'm no expert in explaining how to do this, but I would just argue by analogy here. We've got an international space station. We're doing it with Russia. Do we trust Russia at all? And yet, we have figured out a way to collaborate effectively on a technology project of international importance of the first order, and have done so successfully, protecting our own national interests.
See, we are going to get optimistic here. Okay, there was another hand right here.
But can I defeat this optimism very briefly? Because I
we
regard
were
it
so
as my
close
duty.
to a glimmer of sunlight.
If you're in Moscow, why would you stop doing what you're doing with such clearly such effect? Right? in terms of the political disruption that you're causing in this country, that you're causing in various parts of Europe, right? It doesn't seem to me self-evident that you would want to stop, right? So cooperation, right, international cooperation presumes, right, for it to succeed, or that there is an alignment of interests amongst the parties, right? And so here, I think because of the various asymmetries which favor the Russians that I was referring to earlier, if you are in the Russian position, I just don't see that alignment of interest for international cooperation meaningfully to occur. That's why I'm not at all optimistic about the prospects of any kind of international treaty, right, regulating this form of adversarial behavior. And let's remember that, in fact, it was the Russians that in the late 1990s turned to the United Nations for the establishment of what became the UN Group of Governmental Experts, and it was the Americans that largely that rebuffed that initiative, because in that time the Americans perceived themselves to be in a situation, right, of asymmetrical superiority over the Russians in this space. And now that table has reversed, right, and what we've seen is effectively a failure of the UN round of discussions in precisely this space. And I think it largely has to do with this advantage that the Russians enjoy and want to continue to enjoy.
Okay, I think one last question, yes.
We on? All right. Once again, my name is Tyler Smith. But so earlier you alluded that the use of cyber force, or the use of information, got the right word, constitutes force, and that force is used against the United States every day, if not hourly or minutely. And if any other form of force was used against the United States, it would constitute a state of conflict or war. So my question to you is, what level of information force used against the United States constitutes a state of conflict or even war, and thus necessitates the sort of resource mobilization necessary to combat this threat?
There you go. That's an easy last question.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's, I think if you were to talk to the folks who serve in U.S. Cyber Command, they would say, yeah, we're at war.
Yeah.
Like 100%. That's what we get up every day, we strap in and we fight. Now, we are not mobilized as a population for that. And I think you could argue we're somewhere between, right? Look, international organizations, regional security organizations have been struggling with this. NATO, which is an organization, defensive organization, founded on the principle of an attack on one is an attack on all, has now said that a cyber attack would be deemed a Article 5 threat. Now, arguably, NATO is under attack every day, so the question of what does that actually mean? Is it when an information network isn't completely taken down? Is it electrical grids taken down? That's one of the things that the alliance is still sorting through. So it's a fair question, although I would argue that we see this in other realms. I mean, we can have a 9/11 style terrorist attack, which leads to an 18-year war in Afghanistan, creation of an entire government bureaucracy in the Department of Homeland Security, new legal regime. But then other terrorist attacks do not trigger that kind of response. So I think it's a great question, and I think there's a lot more doctrinal work to do on this. But I do think that there's applications that can be made or we can learn from other realms of warfare.
And it is a great question, and there are two sides to it, basically. One side of the question is figuring out whether an attack that for example, a cyber attack that you've suffered constitutes an act of war in terms of the level of physical destruction or even loss of life, right? Because if it does, well, a lot of your traditional doctrines of thinking will kick into action. And in fact, the day that we see a true act of cyber war, that in some respects is the easy case, because that's the case that you turn to your existing manuals and you have a clear prescription for a reaction. The other side of the question is, if it isn't war, right, or even a use of force under international law, and so far, right, no cyber attack has risen to the threshold unequivocally of an act of war, then you need to figure out what is it and how do you respond to it. The problem is that it's not peace either. Right? This is one of the points that I make in my own writing and research, right? Because here in the West, we have this tradition of thinking along the lines of the binary notions of war and peace. And a lot of rivalrous activity can occur, within the broad space of peace. I mean, economic sanctions under international law are not acts of war, but they can be quite highly damaging, right? But it's important to understand that at least the more significant cyber attacks and information operations that we've experienced in the West are neither war nor peace. And they're not peace in the sense that the consequences of this activity are not tolerable in a way that traditional forms of peaceful rivalry might be. So I've offered a third category of thinking to describe this sort of activity, which is unpeace. Right? And the problem that we have in the West is that we haven't developed doctrinal understandings, right, for dealing with situations of unpeace. Who has developed such doctrinal understandings? The Russians and the Chinese, because they've been at this for, as I said earlier, more than 100 years. Right? And they understand very well, better than we do at least, that you can cause significant political and economic harm without crossing into the traditional threshold of war. And that secondly, if you do this against the West, you can largely get away with it. So we have a major failure in developing our punishment strategy with regards to this form of activity, which I call unpeace.
Okay, so this is a tremendously cheerful note on which to end. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists. Thank you all so much.